So now, with all of these complexities, how are we actually going to determine the value, market value of any specific property? The answer is, it depends. It depends on what type of property we're talking about. In this course, you need to be aware of 4 valuation methods, and each one is used in a specific or couple specific scenarios. The first one is what we call the market comparative approach, and it's probably the one most of you are familiar with. You've probably heard realtors talk about CMAs, comparative market analysis. This is what they're talking about. The market comparative approach says, let's use the concept of substitution to determine what a property is worth. What does substitution mean? It means that if the Johnson's home just sold for $1 million and our home is very similar, we know all homes are unique, but our home is very similar to the Johnsons, then shouldn't we get about $1 million? Maybe a little bit more, maybe a little bit less. But if our homes are similar, then the Johnsons' real sale should be a good basis for us to determine what our property is worth. The market comparative approach based on the concept of substitution is used for residential properties and also vacant land. We put ourselves in the Johnson shoes, but in order to do that, we need real sales. So for the market comparative approach to work, we need sales data. We need recent sales of similar properties. Remember, real estate markets are very localized, so we can't just use any sale. So we have to use sales of similar properties from similar localized communities. What that means depends on the context, but we need recent sales of similar properties. That's the market comparative approach. Now, a lot of times people buy real estate for investment purposes because they're going to rent out that piece of real estate. Perhaps it's a commercial space. When somebody buys real estate for its cash flow investment purposes, we can't use the market comparative approach. Instead, we use the income approach because this is an income generating property. When the primary purpose of the property, and it could be residential, is to generate cash flows income, we use the income approach. The income approach is very similar to the market comparative approach. We're going to compare. But when we compare on the income method, we're not comparing selling prices. We are comparing what's called a rate of return. A rate of return is a very important number to investors. And a rate of return says, what do I get back for what I put in? What I put in is the purchase price of this property. So if I'm going to buy this property for $1 million, what am I going to get back from it annually in rent? Let's say you buy a property for $1 million and you get back annually $100,000 in income. Well, 100,000 divided by 1 million is 10%. That means you're getting a 10% rate of return. And a similar property, larger or smaller, should earn a similar rate of return. That means commercial properties on the same block should earn, relatively speaking, the same amount of rent. Not dollar for dollar, but percentage-wise. Percentage-wise, based on the value of their property, they should earn the same amount. So income-generating properties, we use the income method, which is based on this concept of rate of return. Similar income-generating properties have similar rates of return, which means we're comparing again, which means we need real sales. So if you want to value a commercial property, you need to look for the sale of a similar commercial property that's happened recently. Compare their rates of return, and that should give you an estimate of what your property is worth. So for the market comparative approach and the income approach, we need real sales. We need data. And again, remember, similar, comparable. Remember that localized nature of real estate. But what if we don't have data? What if the property that we're looking at is incredibly unique? Let's say it's a school. Well, schools don't come up for sale. Schools don't generate income. You can't value a school based on what it prepares and makes in the cafeteria. But schools also need appraisals done because insurance needs to be purchased, fire, flood, these types of things. So how would an insurance appraiser look at a school or a museum or a library or a church? Items that don't come up for sale or their income is irrelevant to their value? Cost method. What would it cost to replace it? If this elementary school was destroyed by a flood, what would it cost to replace it? If the Vancouver Art Gallery was destroyed by a fire, what would it cost to replace it? The cost method is used in situations where we have no other choice. We don't have something to compare to because the item is unique. Now, don't be fooled that it has to be only these special types of buildings. It could fall into residential as well. If you have a very unique home, for example, a home that was designed by an architect that has an amazing view that no other property has, or it's a custom hand-built cabin that was built in the 1920s where there's no other property like it, then it falls into this category as well. When the item is unique and has nothing to be able to compare to, we have to default to the cost approach. Well, the last method then says, what if what we're looking at is not really what the value is here? What am I talking about? Remember at the beginning of this section, we talked about tear down properties. When we look at a tear down property, we look past the home that's there right now and we say, hold on. Just because there's a dilapidated house on this property doesn't mean this property has no value, because you could do something else here. Redevelopment potential. The redevelopment potential, we use what's called the residual method. And the residual method says this property has what we call latent value. Latent is a fancy word for hidden. And it means what you're looking at is not its real value. You could redevelop this property. Now, it doesn't necessarily mean that it's a tear-down property, dilapidated home. It just means that the way it's being used today is not its best method of use. For example, imagine a community that is changing. It was very commercial, and now it's becoming very residential. And there's a few commercial spaces left. Maybe they're very good businesses, wonderful businesses. With no competition, they might be great businesses. But the likelihood that the value is much more important or driven by the residential redevelopment potential says, hey, it's not in best use. Maybe it's time to sell to a developer and they'd pay you a very good price based on its redevelopment potential. So don't confuse the residual approach in that the property has to be quote unquote bad. It just means that it might be bad or it's just not in the right place. It has this redevelopment potential. So keywords that you're looking for when it comes to the residual approach is latent value, redevelopment potential, or not in best use. So depending on the property, we are going to choose the appropriate method. It's the property and its type that drives the method that we choose.